Hello,
Hoş geldiniz.
I'm Dr. Işılay Gürsu,
I'm Dr. Peter Cherry.
and welcome to the Heritage Türkiye podcast by the British Institute at Ankara, BIAA.
And today our guest is Professor Andy Fairbairn, better known to some as Andy Hodger, who's an archaeologist and archaeobotanist based at the University of Queensland, Australia, whose work has significantly advanced our understanding of early farming societies in the ancient Near East. And Andy has a long-standing research focus on Türkiye, and he's led major excavations at sites such as Boncuklu Höyük, one of the earliest farming settlements in Central Anatolia.
And he's also closely related with the BIAA since he was a student, basically. And we are very happy to have him with us on his way back from Çumra, because he visits the BIAA almost every season. And this time we have the honor to have him as a guest in our podcast.
Exactly. So welcome, hoş geldin.
Nice to be here.
Great.
Yeah, it's nice to be at the British Institute again and also to take part in the podcast. So thank you very much for the invitation.
It's a pleasure. So let's start at the beginning then. So when did you first come to Türkiye and how did you first become interested in the archaeology here?
I came here as an archaeologist in 1999 and I was employed by the Central Anatolia research project for their 6-month season. They had a 6-month excavation season here to investigate the lower parts of the site, and I was fortunate enough to be employed as one of the archaeobotanists with my wife, who happened to be an archaeobotanist at the time. She is no longer; she's now a librarian. But it was an interesting time because I first heard about Central Anatolia and about the archaeology of the region and Central Höyük in 1988, 1989, when I started my undergraduate degree at the Institute of Archaeology in London. And amongst my lecturers were Jimmy Mellart. It was in his last year as a lecturer, so I found out about Central Höyük and I found out about Turkey and the archaeology of Turkey, which was fascinating for me. I'm from a small village in Northumberland, and archaeology was a bit of a strange thing for me to do. No one in my family's done it, and I was actually very interested in medieval archaeology and castles and fortifications, of which we have very many. I went to London to study, and suddenly I've got a completely different view about what archaeology is. People like Jimmy Mellart, and there's a whole range of people taught us about all these places I'd never really even heard of, including Turkey, of course. And then in 1989, I was in a first year lecture and there was a guy called Gordon Hillman who started to talk about archaeobotany. And he was talking about ancient farming, how people lived in the past, how they did things like manage woodland and make food, and right into the deep past, right into 10, 20,000 years ago. And I was totally fascinated by it. From that lecture in 1989, every single day since, I've basically studied and worked in archaeobotany. So it was a pivotal moment for me. But of course, Gordon Hillman, he was one of the people who developed archaeobotany in Turkey, and in the early 1970s, actually under the tutelage of David French, actually, at the British Institute. So I had this in my background. That was my education. It was part of my undergraduate degree. I actually worked in the UK mainly, and actually worked across Europe. And then through lucky hapt, I ended up being taken on to do some work at Central Anatolia in 1999, and I've been coming back ever since. I've enjoyed the work intellectually. I love the country. It's a fantastic place to be. I've got a lot of friends here, and so I've been very fortunate. And I know since 2000, I live in Australia, which is a long way away. I didn't know anything about archaeology in Australia when I moved there. My wife's Australian and she wanted to go home, so we just thought we'd give it a go. And strangely enough, I've been quite successful there, and I've been able to continue my career. So it's a long way to come, but I really enjoy it, and I have many friends here, and it's a very important place for me. So it's been a key part of my archaeological life, really. But it's interesting I still don't know. Is it fate? I don't know. 10 years from hearing about this is in my first year. Suddenly I'm working in this place that to me was it was part of my imagination. It was my archaeological imagination, So yeah, that's my story, yeah.
Wonderful. You mentioned archaeobotany, so there might be people who are not familiar with the concept. So can you tell us what archaeobotany is, what you do?
Yeah, sure. Look, it's one of those slightly obscure words, I guess. We have lots of them in archaeology, as you know. So an archaeobotany really is the study of how people lived in the world, how they used plants, developed agriculture, did a whole range of things in the environment, actually, if you want to put it like that. But what we do that through studying the remains of plants found in archaeological sites. So people often think about archaeology as being about architecture, about buildings, about pots, about jewellery, about the burials of the dead, which of course it is. But also there's a lot of other material that's preserved, including a lot of everyday rubbish. And archaeobotanists study some of that. Our material is not, it's often very small and hard to see. In fact, until the late 1960s, really, it was only recognised and studied very rarely. But actually, and again, bringing in, British Institute history, David French, in his excavations at Janissary 3 in 1969 to 1970, first started to use this technique called flotation, where you basically throw soil into water. And the plant remains in most archaeological sites are burnt, and they float in water. So a very simple technique. You throw the soil into the water, the seeds and the charcoal all floats, and you basically collect it in a sieve. Completely transform what we did. And that was a huge legacy from the Janissary excavations, actually, and from people like Gordon Hillman who developed those techniques. But what it means is we get these seeds anywhere from maybe 0.5 millimeter in diameter to much larger seeds. They give us an idea of what people were eating. Obviously, food's a really important part of everybody's life, so we can investigate things like food histories and cuisine if we're fortunate to get good preservation. Also, agriculture, farming is a really important part of making sure that we all have food to eat every day. It's fundamental for human life, and now especially with so many people in the world. And of course, that developed over a long period of time. Well, we can trace the development of those farming systems by analysing these seeds. And there's other things too. We know the environment changes through time. There's a lot of concern about that at the moment, about how that's happening. Well, we can reconstruct the past environment from the remains of the plants that people are using and bringing to their site. Often, for example, wood. We find wood charcoal on a site. It can tell you the kinds of trees that were harvested and brought to the site, so we can reconstruct those environments. So yeah, we do. Archaeobotany is very broad. A very broad area of research, and it takes actually quite unpromising material. Not really particularly attractive. It's not, the sort of Indiana Jones kind of gold and whatever and treasure, but it gives us insights that otherwise we simply cannot, we can't have about the past. Yeah.
Because Andy has just mentioned about this flotation technique.
Oh, yeah.
We can just ask a little bit further questions about that. Is it still the same technique that is being used?
And can I also say, isn't it also called the Ankara method?
Oh, yeah, Ankara machine actually is a particular kind of flotation tank. Yeah, and that's actually after David French, and he experimented with flotation. Yeah, look, effectively, it's a very simple method. As I said, you take some water and you put soil in the water, and light material floats to the surface and heavy material sinks. It's a good way of washing and collecting small artifacts, actually, things like beads and stone tools. We have microliths in the Epipaleolithic and in the early Neolithic, actually, these tiny little stone tools. They're very easy to miss when you're excavating with a trowel. So it's it's really a bit of a universal recovery method, and of course we get those plant remains from it. It's known as the Ankara machine because David introduced that, and then at Janissary, and then people kind of took it and applied it in different areas. And he was one of the first people to publish this machine and actually experiment with it. He did a lot of really interesting experiments with methods that didn't quite work. So that's the association with Ankara. And yeah, it's a fundamentally important method. It's very simple. In fact, I've had a student today contacting me from an excavation, asking me about some how to make a tank, and I've been telling him on the phone how to do this flotation machine. And it's actually very, very simple, but it is transformative. And because it's actually effectively made up of things like barrels, plastic piping that you use in irrigation, it's actually very easy, and water pumps, it's very easy to make here. Anywhere in Turkey it can be used. And it's been transformative. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have all this information that we have about plants in the past, and actually a lot of other things that we. You mentioned Boncuklu in the introduction there. We get a lot of things like frog bones and amphibian bones. These small animals that people were eating, And the bones are tiny. Again, you can't pick them out of the ground. You don't see them when you're excavating. So it's not just the seeds and the wood charcoals. Yeah, but it's a fundamentally important method, and has an enduring association with British Institute actually, and with Anatolia.
All the interesting materials.
Well, I think so.
Yeah.
Ceramics are okay sometimes, Yeah, stone tools maybe.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask more about the British Institute's kind of heritage here. So we have at the British Institute, as anyone that comes to visit us knows, a herbarium, which is temperature controlled. What is important about the herbarium? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, there's a collection there. It's a collection of plant specimens that was first collected by Gordon Hillman in the early 1970s, and then continued through the 70s, and then other researchers added to those later on, including Martin Nesbitt. And what that collection was for, are the remains of plants that we find, the seeds, the fruits, the wood. They're very difficult to identify. You have to compare them to modern plants to get an identification. That's the scientific method. You compare the shape, the size, the anatomy, the cellular structure, and you've got to have something to compare to. There are several long-established historic botanical collections and herbaria in Turkey, because the flora here is very diverse. It's been investigated for a long time. It's actually one of the most diverse in Western Eurasia, actually. And there's a long history of studying the flora here. I think it's like maybe 10,000 or more species. But botanical gardens do not like you going into their collections and taking out seeds. And we often do things like chop them up into pieces, because we have fragments of seeds. And sometimes we actually burn them as well, because our material is nearly always burnt. It's not fresh. Fresh plant material will rot in the ground, it decays. So it's burnt, and the burning slightly changes the shape and the size. Well, if you go into if I went to the National Herbarium, the recently established National Herbarium here for Turkey in Ankara, and said, I want to burn some of your plant plant specimens. No.
Yeah, that's not good.
So there was a specific collection set up, which had the herbarium is there to make sure that the identification of the plants is scientifically verified. And then there's a seed collection, a wood collection, which are specimens that archaeobotanists can come and look at and compare to their ancient material. It's a collection, obviously, with who's my professor who established it. And Mark Nesbitt, who added to it greatly. He's a very close colleague of mine, actually. And it's a unique collection here in Turkey. It's a very rare collection in the world, actually. So I'm actually a big supporter of it, and it's wonderful to be able to have that to scientifically verify our observations. If we don't have that, it's very difficult to identify our ancient specimens, and they can be of question. That information can be of questionable value. So it's about verification. It's fundamentally important, actually. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
In most of the cases, my observation is that it's mostly in prehistoric excavations that were relying on archaeobotany. But now more and more classical excavations are also using archaeobotany as an important method. I was actually at one of these excavations recently at Seleucia Sidera in Sparta, led by Bilge Hürmüzlü.
Yes. Yeah.
And their archaeobotanist, Hüreyla, was giving one of those public lectures during one of the evenings. And she asked a very interesting questions that I would like to ask to you.
Okay.
Which is about, and you also mentioned that most of the times the seeds that you find are burned.
Oh, yes.
And there is this conception, this popular conception that these seeds can grow again.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So is it possible are these seeds alive? Is it possible to grow them again? And if not, where does this misconception come from?
It's actually very widespread, that idea. I know it from my home country in the UK. All across Europe, everywhere, people will often ask, there's some seeds found on this archaeological site. Can they be grown? I've heard they can be grown. No, is the answer. It's it's just not possible. All of the archaeological seeds that we get in Turkey and in most sites will be transformed in some way. They're normally burnt. Most of the organic material is actually burnt, but you get basically a little bit left behind. Usually it's in lower temperatures, below about 450 degrees. Above that, everything just turns to ash. But it breaks up the DNA. The DNA is broken up to tiny pieces. There's little bits of DNA in there, but it's basically junk because lots of it's missing. Very difficult. So I know from researchers who work on the DNA, ancient DNA, they've tried very, very hard to get a full sequence. So the whole thing it's dead. It's been killed, and that's why it's preserved in the ground. If we sometimes get seeds that have actually been effectively fossilized, but they're turned to stone. You get minerals in things like toilets and in byres, cattle byres, and they basically make a cast. It's almost like a fossilization process. Again, there's no original material left, so they can't grow. They can't grow. If you get seeds in archaeological deposits which can grow, they're usually recent seeds that have been made their way into the archaeological deposit. That may be through, for example, rats or mice or other animals that have burrowed down there and taken them down there. It may be because it's been very dry and the soil has cracked and you get seeds going down. But no, it's a very common idea, but archaeological seeds are dead. And in fact, most seeds have very short period of viability where they can germinate. Around the world, governments spend billions of dollars a year maintaining seed banks to maintain viability in seeds so that we have seed stock so we can eat. We need to have seeds that we can plant in the future and to safeguard those, especially against disease and that kind of thing. The reason they do that is because seeds only really stay viable for a few years. You might get 10, 20 years out of some seeds, but maybe not even that. It's a huge effort to make sure that they're viable stocks into the future. So no, it isn't. That's not possible. And but it's a very common idea. I think it's a romantic idea. I understand it, but it's not a scientifically based one. And of course, we often hear, especially from Egypt, the idea that people have gone into a tomb and there's some corn, there's some wheat sitting there, and they take it away and they grow it. Well, there's been a tradition right up until the modern day of people leaving small offerings in these tombs as part of, I guess, maybe a sort of folk religion kind of thing, or just. It just makes it some kind of tradition. Well, people find these and think they've been there for 4,000 years. Well, they're not. They're recent. So it's very popular. But I mean, unfortunately, in a way, it'd be nice if these seeds did actually germinate, but they don't, and there's no chance at all.
So anyone takes some seeds from the pyramids and thinks they're going to eat ancient Egyptian bread is sorely mistaken.
No, or it's going to. The only way that you'd have anything that was from that time period is if it's in a sealed tomb. And it would not be very nice to eat. I think it would be pretty disgusting. I think a little bit gritty. Yeah.
So earlier you mentioned that you've been working on seeds that can tell us a little bit about what people ate in the past. What kind of food were people eating in the past then?
Wow, that's a really good question. Foods it's a bit of a chewy topic, if you pardon the pun, in archaeobotany, because actually a lot of the time until recently we haven't really been able to identify the food. Partly because food generally is cooked, it's prepared, you grind up flour and you make bread, and that actually makes the seeds and all the other ingredients really, really difficult to identify. So we often have the leftover bits. We have the agricultural system. We can identify how the farmers have been harvesting the wheat and what crops they've used. But the food's been actually quite difficult. And there's only a few different circumstances where we can really reconstruct the food directly and actually say the kinds of things that people have been eating. One of them is if we find toilets. And then you're getting, obviously, the product of eating. They're actually quite rare here in Turkey. Not too many have been found, but fortunately, recently there's been new techniques where you can use high-powered microscopy to look at actually the ground-up remains of food, and we actually are finding more and more of that. We used to have always, if you work on an archaeological site, you have a pile of material that you say looks interesting, but it's unidentifiable. You can't say what it is. You can't say what plants are in it because basically it's been ground up. And now we actually have techniques for being able to identify that. And in fact, I was just down at Pınarbaşı there, and there were pieces of food from the Early Paleolithic. So this is 16,000 years ago, and they look just like not really very much. They don't look like seeds or fruits, but when you look very closely, you can see the fragments of the seeds and fruits in there. You've got to use higher powered microscopy. I mean, this is actually quite nice to know. They were making bread or a bread-like product then. They were grinding up seeds. We grind up seeds because it makes them easier to digest. We can get more food from them. They're doing that from at least at Pinabaşa 16,000 years ago. But we know actually from the work of Ceren Kabukçu, Turkish archaeobotanist, we know that people have been grinding up food like that for about 70,000 years actually. So bread-like products, where Turkey is a great lover of bread. Makes the entire country work. Well, bread has been produced in this part of the world and in Turkey for a very, very long time. Very, very long time. So that's how we actually recognise the food. Sometimes we're quite fortunate because many of the fruits, they'll have pits and stones that people will throw away. So we'll be able to identify those. We know, for example, like grape. Uzum, it's used in the Mediterranean zone in the area where it grows naturally for a very long time, for about 10,000 years or whatever. But actually then from around about 3,000-4,000 years ago, we get widespread trade in grapes and probably wine at the same time because we can see how these foods are moved around. But food's an interesting one. It's a tricky question, and it's actually been it's taken a lot of research over the years to have the confidence, because you're not looking at an entire seed. For example, a whole, say, wheat grain, you're looking at basically just the pericarp, the outer skin of that grain. That's what you've got left, preserved somewhere in this mush that is bread. But it's a bit of a new frontier at the moment, and archaeobotany, I mean, has developed a huge amount. We're talking about since Gordon Hillman was working, David French in 1969, 1970, in the early 70s, in fact. It's changed hugely, and we're able to use things like high-powered microscopes, scanning electron microscopes, but also a whole range of chemical methods to really help us piece that together. It's not just about the little seeds anymore, it's actually beyond that.
It's so tempting to, come up with more puns and talk about biting off more than you can.
Yeah. Don't worry, we've done them all.
We won't go there. Yeah.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
We mentioned about your work in Boncuklu, which is a site in Konya in Central Anatolia. Yeah. What makes that site special for early farming practices?
Yeah, Boncuklu. It's a funny little site. I mean, it's very close to Central Anatolia, which people will know, World Heritage Site. It's about 10 kilometres away. It's much smaller. It's only a hectare in area, and it's only about 1 to 2 metres in depth. Very small site. We now know that people were living there from about 9,200 BC, right at the start of the post-glacial period, the Holocene, right up until around about 7,600 BC. So 500-600 years before Central Anatolia is occupied. What we were very interested about, we're interested in it because it had these signs that people were living there longer term. It had houses, buildings there that seemed to be permanent. And we're interested in the story of how people are starting to settle down and live in villages, because before then, before really the last 10,000 years or so, most people would be more mobile, live in smaller groups and be more mobile and move around the landscape. One of the big changes that we get with the origins of agriculture and farming around about 10,000 years ago is that people start to live in villages permanently, and it requires a big transformation in the way you live, how you feed yourself, and of course farming is part of that. So farming and village life kind of go together. And there's been a big discussion around how this has happened, where this happened, when it happened. And we know that Turkey is a key part of that. Right down in the southeast is within the sort of Fertile Crescent zone where we have evidence for very early farmers. In Central Anatolia, we're outside the zone in which naturally the crops, the wild plants and animals from which crops and herd animals were derived. We're kind of really on the edge of that area, if not slightly outside it. So the interesting thing about Boncuklu is that we're kind of on the edge, right on the edge of this early farming zone, and it allows us to understand how farming actually spread and moved around outside that area where it first emerged, which I say really runs from down in Jordan up through Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and around Turkey down to Iraq. It's that area. Well, we're outside that. So Boncuklu gives us that insight. And it's been a very difficult project to work on. The archaeology is very fine-grained, the buildings themselves, they're small mud brick buildings, but not like the great big ones you get at Central Höyük East, for example, which we know so well with all of the horns and the walls and the wall paintings. These are much smaller. The archaeology is very fine resolution. And I was the co-director there. It was the project's led by Doug Baird from the University of Liverpool, of course, a great friend of the British Institute as well. And amazing high level of technical expertise in the excavation. But also we threw everything at the site. All of the extraction methods, the flotation, various different scientific analysis to see what we could get out of it. We've got a very complex picture of people's lives there. And the interesting thing is, from the farming point of view, people are in that place from about 9,200 BC. It's in the middle of a very wet area. There are lakes nearby. It's a wetland area. It's the kind of environment that sadly now is no longer still present in the Konya Basin, which had many 1,000 kilometres of that kind of habitat not so long ago. It's all been drained for agriculture now. People seem to be there, and then around about a long time after, 1,000 years after they've been living at this place, they seem to settle down. And they seem to start to experiment with some aspects of farming. They're using wheat, and they're also managing sheep. Those plants and animals do not come from Boncuklu. They've been brought there. They've been brought in. We think now Boncuklu is a small site. People are maybe 150, maybe 100, 150 people are living there. They seem to be living there year round. They're in this wetland area. They're eating lots of frogs, and they're eating birds. They're eating tortoises, anything they can eat. Okay. But they seem to be experimenting with farming, but it's a very small scale. It's not a very common practice there. And one of the interesting things about that time period, and I mentioned Pinabaşı earlier on, these people are living in Central Anatolia, but they're connected to societies across the region. They share a lot in terms of their material culture, how they make stone tools, this kind of thing. They share art and symbolic practices and traditions. But we know from the amazing preservation of the DNA in the people who are buried there that they actually are people of that region. These are Central Anatolians who are from that region, probably descended from the first Homo sapiens to migrate into that region 50,000 years ago. They're not moving up from the Levant, from Syria and from Jordan and other areas. They're actually from that region. But they're connected across the region to these other cultures. And we think through those connections, especially through obsidian exchange, obsidian trade, they're getting the knowledge. And in case of the wheat, the plants that are from a completely different region, and they're starting to cultivate. So it's fascinating. But it's such a very, very fine archaeological record. If it wasn't dug so carefully, you would never find it. It's not obvious. But interestingly, these people, they don't suddenly become farmers. It's not suddenly like, wow, amazing. Hey, we can farm our own food. Why don't we become farmers? For 500-600 years, they seem to be having small numbers of sheep, maybe growing a small amount of wheat. It's not their main way of feeding themselves. Then around about 7,800, 7,600, there seems to be an increase in the amount of farming. But then the site, we have no more occupation at the site. So it's very important for us because it shows us that this in Central Türkiye, agriculture was brought in and it was adapted to the environment through trade, through exchange from elsewhere. But it actually wasn't some revolutionary moment. People don't go, wow, okay, we're going to become farmers. They still do a lot of the same things. Actually, they continue to do those things at Central Höyük as well. And we think Boncuklu is an ancestral site for Central Höyük East. They're doing things differently, bigger scale, but there's this long trajectory. So things change, but actually over a very long period of time. And that's something new for us, really. If you get into Europe, the European agriculture there is actually people from Anatolia originally migrating across into Europe and taking farming with them a couple of thousand years after Boncuklu. It's formed into this way of living, a very complex way of living with plants and animals, very reliable and adaptable. But way before that, and this is in this early stage, and you can see that people are working out how to use these new forms of food, how to manage animals. So for me, it's fascinating. It's very different to what I was told and what we thought of agriculture and its origins when I was a student, which was still, we're just starting to question then the idea of sort of like Gordon Churl's Neolithic Revolution. Everybody goes, yeah, we're going to be farmers and become farmers. No, it's not like that. And there's a lot of innovation and local development of that, especially here in Anatolia in Turkey. So it's, a fascinating story.
Can I ask, so you also have done some work in Australia as well.
Yeah.
So how is it similar, different working in Turkey and Australia?
Wow.
archaeology?
Well, I mean, it's a very different cultural context, very different history. Some of the techniques are the same. We go out on our sites and we use our flotation. And in fact, I've got a lightweight version of the flotation, the Ankara machine that I take with me.
Doesn't come to Melbourne.
No, but it's so we can work out in very remote areas.
You go to Sanayi in Melbourne.
That's right. Yes. No. Well, the equivalent. Yeah, it's the rural plumbing shop in the village that I live in the town I live in Queensland, where, I bought so much plastic piping and so many valves from them. They were thinking about sponsoring me at one point. Look, so some of the techniques are the same, but actually the questions, the context is very different. I've been very fortunate in Australia to work on some very ancient sites from the first phase of human presence in Australia, from 65,000 years ago to about 50,000 years ago. And we're looking there at, people who a few tens of generations earlier had left Africa and migrated into Australia. And very different environments, tropical environments. They're from this early phase. There's a site called Majid Baby there, eating a whole range of tropical fruits and nuts, as well as grinding up seeds, and actually even using an ancestor of rice, actually, interestingly enough. But there is an overlap, actually, and it's not just in method. Right now in Australia, there's been a big discussion about whether Aboriginal people were farmers. And there's an Aboriginal man, a Yuin man, called Bruce Pascoe, who wrote a book 10 years ago called Dark Emu, and he said, he thinks that the evidence has been misrepresented, that Aboriginal people actually were farmers. And it's actually been it took a little while for people to accept this or engage with it, but actually it's set up a whole new wave of research. And the interesting thing is that the methods that we have to use to try and test out archaeobotanically whether these plant remains we get in archaeological sites represent farming, which is cultivation and management, are the methods that we use here, actually, that were developed in this part of the world, but also actually in the Americas as well. To look at things, because what you have when plants when people start to grow plants, they cultivate them, they farm them, the seeds get bigger. You get a change in the way that the plants disperse, and this is preserved archaeologically. So at the moment, we're doing a lot of work. I've got a student who actually is another great friend of Turkey, Michaela Harding, who's been just finished her master's on looking at these seed changes, and it looks like there is some kind of management in the past. Whether we can say it's farming or not, it's another thing. But again, it's in a way, it's like investigating the Neolithic. There's no other way of knowing this now. We have to use archaeological means. And this is 3,000-4,000 years ago, so it's actually quite a long time ago. So the methods do actually overlap, and being so familiar with the investigation, hunting for early farmers here, especially at difficult sites like Boncuklu, actually Pinabasha too. 9th millennium Pinabasha, my goodness. That's meant that I can apply those methods in Australia. And it's great, but it's very different cultural context, but some of the same questions actually.
Whether in Australia or in Turkey, do you ever use local knowledge? Do you rely on local knowledge?
Yeah, we do. And look, traditionally the way that we do that is through formal ethnographic studies. And so I'm not trying to do that. In Turkey, I mean, the permits that I come and do research on are archaeological, so I wouldn't be doing that. But obviously there are people who investigate and discuss with people in Turkey about their plant use, especially their traditional use of wild plants. That's been a really big thing here over the last 20, 30 years. And there are many great accounts of that. So when that information is available, we use it. My Professor Gordon Hillman, he interviewed and worked with a lot of farmers in the early 1970s. And he studied how traditional cropping, so traditional farming, where you're growing the crops, then you're harvesting it and you're processing the grain, how that left a signature in the archaeological record. What plant remains do we get from each of those stages? And that's been fundamentally important. There's not so much of that work been happening now because actually since the early 1970s, farming has changed a lot in Turkey. Some of those traditional practices now are no longer practiced because the farming is much more mechanized. So in a way, he caught kind of the latter decades of that and could record it. And that's been very useful for us because we can go to a site now and say, this deposit here is from the threshing or winnowing of a crop. We can identify that. But yeah, Australia, yes, we do. There is in Australia too ongoing ethnographic work, but also, I mean, now the ethical. The ethics of traditional knowledge has changed quite a lot. We have full ethical disclosure agreements with people with whom we do work, if we do that kind of work. In Australia, the intellectual property, there's some significant intellectual property issues around Aboriginal knowledge, traditional knowledge, and the classic thing there is that a plant will be identified as a potential medicine, then somebody goes and makes a medicine out of it without any benefit coming back to the Aboriginal knowledge holders who produced that knowledge in the first place. Well, things have changed now, and I'm pleased to say, and I mean Turkey is the same. There's very clear ethical guidelines now about how you do that work. So we do, and we rely very much on traditional knowledge. We are 21st century people living very different lives, and we don't have a lot of the knowledge and the expertise that those people have. Expert knowledge holders, whether they're farmers, whether they're traditional knowledge holders out in Australia working in different ways on their country. So it's very, very important for us, actually. Yeah.
Perfect.
Well, can I ask you then, so over the course of your career, are there any particular discoveries or things you found that you're particularly proud of?
Proud of? Yeah, I mean, I've been very fortunate. I've had a very diverse career. I mean, Turkey has been a big part of it, but I've also worked across Europe, and I've worked in Australia, Papua New Guinea as well. So I've actually got many things. I think, look, for me, one of the things that stands out for me here in Turkey was actually the first phase of the work that I was involved with at Central Anatolia, because that was this legendary site. A lot of work was done, and we managed to pull together, actually in a very few years, the first body of work on that to look at what actually was a very stable way of living for several hundred years at Çatalhöyük. I was actually very proud of doing that, partly because it was my history as well, with people like Gordon Hillman, who actually had looked at some Çatal material, and also there's a guy called Hans Hellbeck, the Danish, one of the great fathers of archaeobotany, who was out here in the 50s and 60s doing work, and did the first work with Jimmy Mellor at Çatalhöyük. So I was actually very proud of that, from the fact that it was such a big project, and together with my colleagues, we could pull together actually a good story upon which further work has been built. To me, that's kind of boring. In a way, it's a boring, nerdy thing, right? Yeah, I'm supposed to say I found a gold helmet or I found a bronze shield or something. No, for me, that was actually a major achievement, and I felt very fortunate to be part of that. In some of the other parts of the world, there are things like in Papua New Guinea, being at a 2,000 meter high valley, going back to a site that had been excavated in 1970, and walking up to the section and cleaning it. And I was there to look for early plant foods. And I looked in the section, I thought, what is that? And there was a complete charred pandanus nut in the section, because my colleagues had said, "Oh, you're never going to find anything, it's a waste of time." And I kind of went, "That's right, yeah, I'm never going to find anything." It was a 37,000-year-old. No, it was buried in a volcanic ash, actually. Little things like that, it gives you a little bit of goosebump moment. 37,000 years, a long time ago.
Yeah,
that is, it's very hard to imagine. And things like the Majid baby, this is the time depth in Australia is really interesting. You asked me about that earlier on. Somebody said 65,000-year-old site. That is such a long time ago. I'm used to thinking about thousands of years, 10,000, 15,000 years. 50,000, 60,000 years to me I find it very hard to comprehend that time and what life was like. So they're the things that really kind of, I guess, spin my wheels, if you like. They're the things that I find really interesting. So, and I find it interesting now. I started doing archaeology in 1988. So that's a long time, and that still gets me really excited, thinking that we can look into that world, even if it's just a little tiny window. I mean, magic. How lucky am I to be able to do that?
Yeah.
It's fantastic. But there are some more recent things as well which I enjoy. I mean, in Australia, that was right. There was a burnt shop from the 1860s in Melbourne, and there was some tea. There's some tea in a jar, and I loved finding that tea because I'm English.
Yes.
And again, like my dear Turkish friends here, we love chai, don't we?
Yeah.
It's like, and I was like, wow, I found some archaeological tea. So it's little things like that really, that for me, that I look back on and enjoy, actually. But the other thing as well is I'm very fortunate. I have some students here at the moment, and being able to bring students into this world and give them a view of that is really, I was fortunate enough to have my professor do that, and I try and do that myself. And it's wonderful to see some of these people who've maybe never been outside Australia before come here and you know, and they love the work, they love being on site, they love excavation and doing the archaeobotanical work. I think that's a real thrill for me too.
I think we can ask several questions to Andy. I mean, this is so very interesting, everything we're talking about. But we usually ask as the last question about the BIA's contribution to your career, and what are your thoughts for the BIA's future?
And how have you benefited as well, I think?
Well, I mean, look, as I've just said, I mean, I benefited from people whose careers were supported themselves. I mean, yeah, Gordon Hillman would have not had that career if he hadn't been supported with both. He was a British Institute fellow in the early 70s with David French. So, I mean, it goes right back into my kind of ancestry as an archaeologist. Personally, I've benefited. I've had some research funding years ago, I think 2000 or something like that, for the Central Höyük work. I have benefited from being able to come here and use the collections, and also it's my home away from home. You know, I'm fortunate to see you guys when I drop through, and I'm one of these strange people who falls from the clouds, right, every now and again, and says hello, and you know, and we have tea at 11 o'clock every morning. So it's a home away from home, and because I live in Australia, it's a long way to come. It's very expensive. I really, when I come here, I have to be here for the work that I need to do. Then I go back home again. I can't go back and forward. So I'm often here for anywhere from 6 to 13 weeks, actually, historically from 2001, in fact. Some years I haven't been able to come. So the British Institute, it's a sort of like a fixed point. It's a place, it's home away from home. The reference collection is wonderful. It's really been fantastically taken care of now, and to being able to have the library here. So there's all of that. I think it's really important. As an archaeologist, it's an important institution. And I mean, I encourage my students to come here too, and to take advantage of the facilities. In terms of the future, I mean, I see that the British Institute over my time has broadened its interests. It's very much more broad humanities and social sciences institute now. I think that's for the good. I think we can sit in our little disciplinary boxes, and it's nice to see that. It's good to see the whole range of people who are coming through. I think to continue and prosper. I would love to see the reference collection I would love to see that maybe with the appropriate collaborations here with obviously Turkish botanical institutions and professionals to expand that, because the collection itself is good, but we need more of it actually, because Turkey's flora is very complex, and we've never been able to do some things with the identifications that will be really helpful. Because the level of identification, it allows us to maybe identify different kinds of activities, different environments. We can't quite do that. So I would love to see that. And all the best to the Institute, I think. I say it's been an important element of supporting me, but also making me feel comfortable here, and not that Turkey is a difficult place to work, I have to say. Good luck. I look forward to seeing you prosper into the future.
Well, thank you. It's always a joy to have you in Ankara. And although you say it's second home from home, I do think you've got a membership of the Konya Spor fan club, which would suggest that maybe you're more Konya than Ankara.
Well, I'm not sure if we should comment on that, but yes, I am an official Konya Spor fan indeed. So please don't hate me for it.
Okay.
We won't.
On that,
I've spent years in the Konya plane. I mean, what can I do, right?
So, on that Heritage Türkiye exclusive,
bombshell.
Thanks very much, Andy, for your time.
Thank you, Andy.
Absolute
It was
pleasure.
a pleasure.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
And görüşürüz.
Görüşürüz.